Hi, everyone. Welcome to Afikra. My name is Mikey Mhenna. Thanks so much for joining on a Tuesday day, afternoon, evening, wherever you are. I'm very honored to welcome Suheyla Takesh, who is a curator and a writer at the Barjeel Art Foundation. She works on research and the curatorial development of exhibitions and oversees the production of publications. An exhibition she curated at the Aga Khan Museum in 2015 titled Homeground was named Toronto's top art show of the year by Now Toronto. Her writing has appeared in peer-reviewed journals including Thresholds and the Rutgers Art Review. She holds a master's degree from MIT's Department of History, Theory, and Criticism of Architecture and Art, where she was a student in the Aga Khan program for Islamic architecture. She is the curator of Taking Shape, Abstraction from the Art World, 1950s to 1920s, at the Gray Art Gallery in New York, which is set to travel to several venues in the US. Suheyla, thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, Mikey. Thank you so much for having me on. I'm a big fan of afikra and all the work you guys are doing.
Thanks so much. This is such a privilege. So I'm going to ask you a really stupid question. And what does the word curator mean? Because we live in a curated world. What does the word curator mean to professionals who call themselves curators? Please.
Oh my gosh. Mikey, if only I knew. You know, it's so funny. I feel like my folks still don't really know what I do. And so at family events, they just say like, yeah, she works in a gallery. And so I'm like, yeah, kind of, sort of, but not exactly.
Well, let me help you out. Tell me what a curator is not. What is not part of your job responsibility?
Oh, God. You know, Mikey, I feel like it would probably be easier to answer it the other way around.
Okay, go for it. Go for it.
Well, it's... That's a great question. You're like pulling out the big guns from the very start. But you know what? I feel like it's a position where you're switching hats every day. There's a lot of there's an administrative aspect to it where you're like literally working on emails and databases and lists and things like this. But then there's, of course, the more exciting kind of creative side to it. Can you guys hear it? It's raining and there's thunder outside my window.
Amazing.
Yeah. Anyway, so, you know, when it comes to actually putting exhibitions together, it's, you know, essentially everything from the conceptualization of a show to the selection of artworks, to overseeing kind of what kind of texts are written for the catalog and you know, all of the kind of different logistical aspects as well. But, you know, Mikey, I think the reason it is so difficult for me to answer this question is also because Barjeel is sort of unique in its structure and it's also operational dynamics. So it operates a little bit differently from, say, like a museum or a more formalized kind of institution or foundation. Our team is quite small, and so what ends up happening is we're always kind of our responsibilities bleed into one another's, and it just kind of, you know, you come into the office every day and somebody's like struggling to finish a thing. You're like, okay, let me get that. And like you work on something else. And so in that way, it's really different every day. And also because, you know, because it's not kind of a traditional structure of an institution, we also have a lot more fluidity. So there's always kind of like an ebb and flow with how things are done, with how sort of energy and hours are managed. It really depends on what we're working in any specific stretch of time, you know? And also because of this fluidity, I feel like we can move between different types of tasks. Like we can diversify really quickly. Sometimes it's just kind of like a matter of a conversation where we can say, you know, hey, I'm thinking about for example, like launching a poetry competition, what do you think about it? And
yeah, of course.
Because we don't have, such rigid structures on the inside, we actually can do it, right? Like we can jump in and start all of these different kinds of projects. So,
okay, that makes sense. I mean, for me, I think curators are like editors, right? They're unsung heroes that are trying to make sense of these larger pieces, right? And they're trying to help hone a message, right? And so I feel like you've started to answer the question, but I'm still not satisfied. Annoyingly, I'm still not satisfied. So I want to look at some of the exhibitions that you've curated over the last sort of like 8 years, right? 8 or 9 years.
That's 7 or 8, yeah.
So if you think about like, if you take a look at like lines of subjectivity, portrait and landscape paintings, right? And you're trying to sort of engage in the curatorial process. How do you begin that process? Walk me through sort of the nitty gritty. Like you guys come up with this idea. How do you begin? How do you walk me through that? What does that process look like? The curatorial process does it start with conception of the idea or with the sort of ingredients you have on the table, and like how does it really work?
Yeah, that's a great question. And again, I will say it really also depends on the project.
Yeah.
So, to be completely honest with you, Mike, I actually didn't kind of knowingly set out to become a curator or like to pursue this line of work. And I always feel like the stars kind of lined up for me there, because in 2013, I walked into the Barjeel Gallery and I had I wasn't aware of the collection or the foundation prior to then, but I really loved the show that was on at the time. It was called Reorient. And so I emailed the foundation, and that was kind of the first connection, and things unfolded from there. And I was actually first hired as a collections coordinator. So my job was supposed to be a lot more focused on kind of the administrative side of things, but because the kind of the dynamics within the foundation are so dynamic, I was asked to curate a show a few months in. It was like a first show. I think it's here. It's called Sky Over the East. It was a show in Abu Dhabi. And so, I didn't really know I didn't at all know what I was doing at the time, but it set the ball in motion. And so, I would say, sometimes the works inform the process and the method which you end up pursuing in the development of an exhibition. Sometimes it's the idea. Yeah. So, for instance, our latest show on abstract art, that started with an idea, but when we actually came to work on the exhibition, we almost started working backwards, where we selected the works, kind of in a preliminary way first, and then started diving into the research and discovering all these things. And we're like, we didn't know all of this is abstraction. And now we have to like expand the book and include more essays because this doesn't cover it, So, again, it goes in different ways. I don't know. Maybe in other kind of institutions, there's a more a structured way of how these things are approached, or there's like sort of a step-by-step, almost, like manual that one would follow, but it's not really the case with Barjeel, and things, happen more organically.
Yeah. Okay. So we've kind of we've come to this idea of abstraction, and so let's take a moment and, as I like to say, explain to me like I'm 15. What is abstraction in the context of art more broadly? If you're speaking to somebody who's getting their, taking an entry-level art history class, what does abstraction mean in that context, and what does it mean in the context of the Arab world?
Yeah. So, if you were to pick up a history book on sort of modern art, global modern art, the likes that are taught in university classes, chances are that abstraction would be defined as something like, reducing reality to its basic elements or schematizing reality. It's all about stripping down of the excess and leaving only the, what is called the essence, which, again,
Sure.
could be anything. But when we began this project and we began sort of asking ourselves what abstraction is and compiling literature lists and so on, most of the sources, of course, that we were able to locate dealt with abstract art in sort of North American and European contexts. And abstraction was, the term itself was very much linked to this moment in early 20th century with figures like Kandinsky and Malevich and Mondrian and, all of these artists in like the 10s and 20s in Europe.
Yeah.
So when we started selecting the works, Lynn Gumpert, the co-curator of the exhibition, she came over to Sharjah and we spent some time with her in our warehouse going, sifting through these works. And the way that we made the preliminary selection was just based on our visual perception of what abstract art should look like.
Yeah.
And of course, this was also conditioned by our prior experience with how we've seen abstraction being presented or what we've learned in art history classes. So just based on that, we kind of, selected what we thought abstract art was.
So wait, before you keep on going, what were you wrong about? Or what were you less than right about? Like what did your first draft not quite get right that with further discovery and further research that you realize, oh, wow, we were kind of off about this? And you were probably delighted by that discovery, but what did you get wrong?
Absolutely. Well, one of the things, as an example, was that some of these artists didn't necessarily even pursue abstraction as, a stylistic approach. They framed their work completely differently, which, we can dive into a little more later on in the conversation. With other artists, they were basing their work on things like the alphabet, whether it's the Arabic alphabet or the Amazigh, the Tifinagh alphabet, on symbols and tattoo patterns. So then, if we think of abstraction as reducing reality to its basic elements, then, is it even possible to abstract a letter form, which is already not a thing, right? It's already an abstract kind of symbol. So then it just kind of warped our brains a little bit to think about these things. We began asking questions, should we really be trying to fit these works into the established art canon, or is there room for a new definition, new
Sure.
kind of understanding of what all of this means or can mean?
So I know that, so obviously art is, borderless in many different ways, and artistic movements, bypass sort of regions, geographic regions as well. How much was this movement in the Arab world informed not only by the abstract movement, maybe in sort of standard European and North American, within the sort of North American and European context, but how much was it also informed by sort of like the Latin American or the Pan-African sort of abstract movement, if at all? Was there a sort of a global conversation happening that informed these works in a secular way?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there was always this conversation and a fluency of exchange, and these artists traveled to study abroad a lot of the times. Many of them actually were trained in art academies and art schools in Europe and North America, but also in other places like the Soviet Union and China and all across the world, really. So in this moment of decolonization and when new identities were being formed or formulated, of course, many artists also began to sort of mine their local histories for references that can be used within the definition or sort of the articulation of their identities. But that is not to say that they were trying to isolate themselves from global conversations. In fact, many of them kind of declared it their aim to merge or to kind of converge their training, which a lot of the times kind of was influenced by movements like Impressionism and Cubism and Abstraction as it was understood in Europe, with their local kind of material histories. So in this bid for authenticity, there was not necessarily kind of an isolationist agenda, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, what I find interesting is I like the idea of movements starting. Right. People like to talk about, or I feel like I hear conversations around movements starting. I don't know if I hear conversations about movements ending. When did this movement end? When did we get over abstraction? When we're like, you know what? Write the whole word out. Show the full ornament it out. Like what?
Well,
you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah. No, that's a very cool way of thinking about it. I don't think it really ever ended. Like, maybe not abstraction per se, but just the idea of sort of non-figurative, non-objective art.
Sure.
Artists are still like doing it and working in these kinds of approaches, and if I may just go back a little bit to your previous point about sort of global artists and art transcending national borders and geographies and so forth. As a curator, I always ask myself this question, are we, especially when we're terming things or naming exhibitions, I think, okay, are we doing any disservice to these artists by placing them under these umbrellas of the Arab world or North Africa or what have you? And there's, sort of legitimate critique of that. And so one could argue, it would be a lot more accurate to just say, this is an artist, not this is an Arab artist, right? But I have to say, even though I agree with that wholeheartedly, kind of in theory, but in practice, I feel like there's still kind of a time lag between how quickly the intellectual discourse is happening and how things are implemented in practice, in how works are shown or how they're written about. So I feel like we're still at a stage where building up the knowledge banks and kind of formulating theories and really on a basic level, we're still documenting a lot of the time. So, I can't wait for a time when artists from the region can be shown and written about on an equal footing with artists from other parts of the world.
Yeah.
When we have as much literature on Mohammed Khadd as we have on Picasso, or as many books on the Casablanca school in Morocco as we have on the Impressionists, then I think this question would just fall off by itself. It would become, all of these umbrellas would become redundant, but I think we're still working towards that. So,
yeah. So I've been showing these images on the screen from the book and from the show. Were these artists fans of each other? I mean, when you talk about the Casablanca school, right? That's a group of people who aesthetically are trying to pursue something and metaphorically or symbolically trying to achieve something, right? And are kind of working side by side. In hip hop terms, it's like the Wu-Tang Clan. Right? They're all trying to do something else, right? Sometimes I wonder, does Atal Adnan really like the work of Ibrahim, the Sudanese guy? I'm blanking on it.
Ibrahim Salahi.
Salahi, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Is she a fan? Is he a fan, so to speak, because they're aesthetically really different, which is delightful. But I wonder, is this a movement that they all feel like they have membership cards to?
Yeah, that's so interesting to think about because, even though we kind of speak of these artists as all working towards formulating these new identities and new visual languages and kind of, decolonizing culture, which I think many of them would subscribe to. But within those circles, there were also kind of internal debates that were happening, and artists were critical of each other. I mean, in Iraq, for example, there was kind of a very heated debate about the idea of form versus content in the 1950s, and the artists were quite split along those lines. A lot of the times, artists are split along political lines and sort of the kind of ideologies they subscribe to, which gets translated then into their work. So actually, there have been quite harsh published material between artists, speaking about each other and critiquing each other. So that was definitely there, even though that, in the large scheme of things, maybe they would have subscribed to kind of similar, bigger ideas. But internal debates were definitely happening, very much so.
Okay, I want to take a break from abstraction for a second and talk about the predated this exhibit, the short century, and talk a little bit about how these two sort of curated shows can exist side by side, and what do you think that they're really saying to each other? Almost like there's this almost like a reply that's happening, right? This one that predates that. What do you think let me ask the question precisely. What were you trying to say with the short century, and how is that different than what you were trying to say with taking abstraction?
Yeah, well, with abstraction, we were really trying to focus in and hone in on what it really meant, that one thing, right? We kind of applied the term to different works and asked, does it work? If not, then why? So it was very kind of focused. With the short century, the bigger objective was to show a broader kind of selection of works from across the region, to highlight the key moments, the key figures. And so it wasn't as tightly curated as the Taking Shape exhibit, but the aim with this one was, a little bit different as well. I would say this one, and also the exhibition that is on at the museum at the moment, this is a chance for the works of, some of the most kind of significant and key figures from regional art history to be on display on a medium to long term, where the different audiences, but also students and researchers can come and visit and see Marwan, see Hamid Awais, because there are very few places in the region where if you're writing on someone, there's an opportunity to go and have a look at their work, except if it's on some kind of temporary display somewhere, right? So there aren't as many museums with sort of long-term displays of the region's sort of most important artists. So that was one of the objectives with a broader show like this.
So so this is kind of going off topic. Do you see yourself as part of Barjeel? And there are many people from Barjeel on the phone, including Sultan and Noor and a bunch of other people, but I'm curious for your perspective. Do you see yourself as having a particular public education role? Are you trying to educate? Is that a big part of what you're trying to do? And a secondary question is, do you see the success of different shows through that lens? How much did we educate? Is that something that you think through?
Yeah, I think it's something you grow into. When I first joined the foundation, I mean, I'm still educating myself, but at that point I was really clueless. So that kind of an objective wasn't really even on my mind, but speaking from like the perspective of now and the work that we're doing now, then yeah, definitely. I mean, apart from exhibiting the collection, a lot of what we do has to do with documenting and research and engaging the public, and also kind of experimenting with different ways of engaging the collection in these conversations, which is probably why we're, thinking of things like the poetry competition or like a volume of essays on a particular art movement, in order to kind of advance the scholarship of these things. And, when we chatted before the talk, this idea of cultural diplomacy came up, and it's it's a concept that sort of comes up a lot in connection to Barjeel's work. And so after we chatted, I got curious and actually went and looked up the word diplomacy in the dictionary, because, I feel like after you've used a word or a phrase for so long on repeat, you can kind of lose sight of what it means fundamentally, or like what you're trying to, what was originally.
By when I asked you to define curator.
Absolutely. I mean, I had no idea. So I went and I looked it up, and apart from the, more of like a political science definition of the link to international relations, it said, actually, I wrote it down. So it said, diplomacy is the art of dealing with people in a sensitive and effective way.
Sure.
And so, I thought like, bouncing off of this kind of definition, I mean, I hope that doing what we do, we are able to pursue these kind of, ideas of sensitivity and effectiveness of communication, in how we tell stories and how we show regional art. And of course, I mean, there's obviously kind of a more literal connection to cultural diplomacy that can be ascribed to Barjeel. I mean, we're like literally taking the collection to different parts of the world and to different countries and showing it there. But I think, at least for me, a more important, or not important, but a more exciting aspect of it all is not necessarily kind of, building links or connections between countries, which is how cultural diplomacy might be understood in the classical sense. And if it does, I mean, great. But I think it's more about kind of increasing the visibility of this art and increasing opportunities for interaction of this art with this art of not just museum goers and the general audience, but also researchers and writers. And in other words, it's an opportunity for this art to be seen and recognized as like an integral part of developments globally and sort of part of global modernism. So, I mean, if that's cultural diplomacy, then yeah, I would definitely subscribe to that.
No, I think also on a very sort of fundamental level, you guys are taking the show on the road. So a big part of diplomacy is like literally going places and meeting people and meeting them where they're at and trying to, put your cards on the table and say, this is who we are and we would like to get to know each other, which is what you are doing, in spades. So for sure, it's a really big part of, I think, one of the reasons why Barjeel is really special. Before I go to the questions, the sort of quick Q&A, I'm curious, what do you think Barjeel is bad at right now that you are trying to get really, really good at? What are the weak spots that you're like, man, we got to get better at this? Not because the world wants us to, but because we want to.
Yeah.
We need to get better at this yesterday.
You know what? We say yes to so much. Like we get these ideas and we're like, oh my God, it's so cool. Yeah, let's do it. And then you're like, oh no. So it's, and I always think like, okay, next time we just have to pace ourselves, but it's just one of those.
Programmatically, like what about the program that you guys are doing? So for example, I'll ask myself the thing for afikra. I'm really frustrated that we aren't publishing Arabic content. Right?
Okay. Mm-hmm.
That's what we needed to get better at yesterday. Programmatically, not in terms of operationally. Operationally, we got to do a lot of things better. But programmatically, what are you sort of looking at? Like maybe 3 weeks ago or 3 months ago or 4 months ago, you would have said, man, I really want to do a poetry competition. But you launched that. So like, what are some of the things that you're like, we need to really be focusing on? Like, I wish we did a exhibition on Pan-Arab art and sort of the interaction between or Pan-African art and sort of the interaction between African art sort of across the continent and African art in the Arabic-speaking part of the continent, and what that would look like. I don't know, I'm making this up, but I'm curious, what is an itch that you are dying to scratch programmatically? And it might be the next big project that you guys work on.
Well, I'm just going to say, like, for me personally, maybe other team members could have a different thing, but I would really love to work on an exhibition that would bridge kind of different parts of the region. So, we have done kind of a show in Tehran, for example, where Iranian art came into play and was displayed alongside, art from the Arab world. But I would just really love it if we could include sort of South Asia, Turkey, into this conversation. So for me, that would be such an interesting project. And also, I feel like we would all learn so much about these networks and the kind of exchange that happens. So that's my personal...
Okay, great. Okay, so I have 4 quick questions, and then we're going to turn to over the town hall. So if you haven't typed a question, and nobody has typed a question, if you haven't typed a question, please do so in the chat. Okay, so first question is, what are you reading or watching right now?
Well, I'm not watching a lot of things because I deactivated my Netflix a couple of months ago, but this morning, this morning I was reading from a book on Seta Manoukian called Painting and Levitation. And she's this, she's an artist born in Beirut and to an Armenian family. And she has an incredible biography. Like, she lived through the 67 war and the Civil War, and then got increasingly more interested in spirituality. And in 2005, I think she became an ordained Buddhist nun in Tibet. Super fascinating.
Painting and levitation? Oh, painting in levitation.
In levitation, yeah.
Cool. Okay, that's awesome. That's a good one. Okay. Would you like to shadow past or present if you could for a day?
I would love to spend a day at the studio of the late Asim Abu Shakra. He is this Palestinian citizen of Israel artist, born in al-Fahim, trained in Tel Aviv. He passed away at a very young age from cancer. I think he was like 28 or 29, but he already developed such a mature career, and both aesthetically and conceptually, just so cool. One of my favorite artists for many years. Cool.
Okay, what do people most misunderstand about your work or your line of work? Misconceptions.
Well, I mean, that's the one, is that people just don't know what I do, even my own parents. But also, a question I get a lot is like, why do you guys start working on shows a year or 2 in advance? How long does it take to hang some paintings on a wall, So I think that's probably one that I get a lot.
Interesting. Yeah. Okay. And whose work do you admire and or are inspired by?
So when I was thinking about this question, I asked myself, who do I want to be when I grow up? And I picked an individual that I got to know in Sharjah. Her name is Ulrika Khamis. She is a historian of Islamic art, and she used to work at the Museum of Islamic Civilization in Sharjah. And she's, a brilliant professionally, but I really admire her for her kindness and sincerity of character. And I, just hope I have a fraction of that when I am older.
Okay, that's great. Okay, my last question before we go to the things. What is special about Sharjah? You grew up there. What Why is there so much art in Sharjah? Walk me through that.
Well, to be Sharjah, again, this is kind of a personal perspective and view, but Sharjah is kind of a place where it's more about the work. So a lot of the times we kind of like forget to market what we're doing, but we are doing a lot of work, and it across kind of different institutions and different spaces, and it's something that like works well with me, which is why I find it special. There's always something that you're doing. You're always kind of working on exciting things, and
okay,
yeah,
there must be something in the water. That's the only explanation. Okay, great. I'm going to pass it over. You are a delightful person to talk to, so I won't occupy the entire time. So, Dalia, you're up first. If you can unmute yourself.
Thank you guys for this talk. It was super enlightening, super interesting. I have many, many questions, but the primary question that I have is just your perception on the direction that art is taking in this region. If you're picking up on any current trends, what you think are some interesting trajectories, I'd just love to hear a bit about that.
Yeah, that's a great question. To be completely honest with you, Dalia, for the past like 2 or 3 years, I've been so much more focused on researching sort of the 50s, 60s, and 70s that sometimes I lose sight of what is going on right now. And so it's difficult for me to identify trends. I do have artists whose work I completely admire and do follow. But in general terms, I think I wouldn't be the best person to kind of best equipped to answer your question. But, when it comes to things like exhibition of regional art abroad and the sort of the writing of histories and so on, I do see that it is becoming a lot more nuanced. There's already a community of writers and researchers that has been formed, and so that's really nice to see. I think the discourse is becoming a lot more serious and rigorous. So that's a very joyful thing to see.
Thank you.
That's great. Thanks, Adio. Jude, you're up next if you want to unmute yourself.
Hi. Thank you, Mikey and Suheyla, for this. This is such a treat. I was just curious because I noticed that a lot of the documentation that you showed in the slideshows and even just how you talk about the work, Suheyla, you reference mostly paintings or like 2D. And I was curious if there was any grounding research or continued research around 3D artworks, sculptures, projections, installations in the realm of abstraction or just contemporary Arab art in general. If you could speak to that at all.
Well, yeah, there's definitely, a lot more than painting to regional art. The collection, I would say, the Barjeel collection in particular, in the modern period is quite painting heavy. But that is not to say, of course, that sculpture didn't necessarily exist. So in the Mikey has a slide up in the show. We have that only one sculpture by Salwa Rawda I'm actually not aware of specific studies on like 3-dimensional works as a category by which like art is studied. There might be, I just might not be aware of them. But there have been a number of artists practicing in the abstract mode with sculptures. So at the museum now, we have a beautiful work which was acquired sadly after the exhibition already opened, so we couldn't include it. But it's by Lebanese artist Nadia Saikali, and it's such a cool. It's a sculptural work, but it's also a light installation, which was done in the 1970s, which is quite early for a work like that. So there's definitely a lot of beautiful kind of work. And, here I'm not even like touching upon the contemporary. There's a lot more exciting and kind of variegated installation and video and things like this that came up more recently.
Okay, I'm going to ask a question. Are you on the selection committee, and what are the criteria to acquire a work?
Yeah, again, so going back to this idea of Barjeel having a unique structure, at the moment there isn't an independent board or a selection of a formalized selection committee for the acquisition of artworks. So while we do take advice from different individuals that, Sultan consults with, and so, decisions, again, even here, decisions are taken in a very organic way. And sometimes acquisitions happen very quickly. If we all feel like, yeah, this is a work we should definitely have. Sometimes, if there's disagreement, we would go and research a little more, talk to more people. But, again, this is one of those areas where with time, potentially, it would be a more kind of sustainable option to have a more formalized maybe way of acquiring works. But even here, this is sort of like, I feel like the structure, it's always kind of, there are two sides to the same coin. On the one hand, where it presents potential challenges, it's also kind of gives us our strengths in the fluidity and the pace with which decisions can be made. It is actually possible to make decisions really quickly because there aren't as many layers to go through. But, when talking about criteria, again, it's a number of things. One important thing is that, because we're trying to tell sort of cultural histories and also sort of social and political histories of the region through the artwork. So that becomes an important thing to consider. What context was the work made in? What is it about? What does it reflect? What was it in response to? Things like this. Of course, aesthetics, although it's not kind of on the top of the list, but it is an important consideration. And there's kind of a number of factors like the art market and available funds and all kinds of things. Personal preference, I'm sure, seeps in there as well. So
that's great. Okay, so I have two other questions as people, to give people a little more time to talk, to ask a question. If you were to recommend two or three artists who are, I don't want to say underrated, but artists that you have come across through your work that, people should be spending a little more time exploring their work because there's maybe a little underneath the surface, or they don't have as big of a platform as, for example, like Attel Adnan's work comes up all the time, like Marwan's work comes up a lot all the time. Who should people go check out?
Yeah, some of these artists, as I mentioned, we're still documenting, right? So a lot of them haven't exhibited as widely. One artist we discovered while we were working on the Abstract show, and we just found her family online, was Minhat Hilmi, who I wasn't aware of, but brilliant artist, and there's sort of like a gold mine there. A younger artist I would recommend, whose work I really like, is Mohamed Munaysir from Egypt. He was actually introduced to me by a friend, and I checked out his work and really fell in love with it. So that's another artist I would say really kind of.
Sultan has a recommendation for somebody that you really like. In the chat, he's saying that Afaf Zureik is somebody.
Oh, I do like Afaf Zureik. I do like her work a lot as well. And yes, she's one of those artists that we only, at least, it's my own ignorance, but discovered only very recently, and we've actually had a number of conversations with her since, and she's both wonderful as a person and as an artist.
Okay, this is fantastic. So do you have, I will give you an opportunity, do you have any questions that are sort of, that you have for me, or that you have that are sort of picking away at you, things that you're curious about these days that we should know about before we sign off?
Questions to you?
Or that you want to air in front of me? And in front of the rest of the people on the call.
Well, I mean, I guess because it's your birthday, guys. I mean, you just turned 6 years. So
yeah.
I'm curious, is there any, like, one thing you feel like you might have done differently? Or something that, you know, you kind of learned in the process and you think, okay, now we're going to do it this way?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that, you know, like we always use the phrase cultivate curiosity. And that's like a very sort of pedagogical challenge. And so thinking through what that curriculum really looks like, when you sit down with somebody who says, I want to ask a question, but I actually have no idea what to ask, or I want to be interested and I'm coming up blank.
Yeah.
So going through that sort of curricular challenge of how do you actually resuscitate those muscles that people are born with, but how do you actually think through what exercises and what movements and what stimuli need to actually be introduced to resuscitate these muscles. Some people have tons of questions and it comes out like a fire hose. And some people have kind of lost that, and the pipes haven't had water running through them for a while, but the pipes are still there. And so it's a matter of how can we get this flow working again? And so that is something that we are constantly not good enough at, but we're figuring out.
Well, methodology is always like, I mean, I feel like a broken record whenever I bring it up, but it's one of those things, like, it's hard.
It's hard.
Yeah.
Spoiler alert, it's hard. Okay, so thank you so much, Suheyla. You're such a pleasant person to talk to. I feel like I could talk to you for a very, very long time.
Well, that's mutual. I feel the same way.
And so those of you who are on the call, please give us feedback. We're trying to get better every single day. So go to the link in the chat, afikra.com/wasthisgood. It's a one-question chat. If you'd like to support us, everything we do is free and open to all. If you want to become a Patreon member, you can go to our Patreon account and become a member. And attend upcoming stuff. Listen to the podcast, go to the YouTube page. Sultan's episode is both on our YouTube page and on our podcast. Check out our library. Everything is open. We're trying to build this big, beautiful digital public library, open to all. Thank you to Suheyla for being so generous with your time and your perspective, and to the whole Barjeel team who has come this week.
I know.
A team meeting on the call.
Thanks for being here, guys.
Have a wonderful evening, wonderful day wherever you are, and stay safe, stay strong, stay curious, all those things.